In the frozen wasteland of 1880s Montana Territory, a desperate widower's last hope for survival arrives mysteriously in the back of his wagon. Silas Brandt had sent for a mail-order bride out of necessity, not love, someone to help save his failing homestead and dying daughter. When Lark Whitcomb appears like an answer to his prayers, she brings with her secrets darker than the Montana winter. But their fragile new beginning shatters when a wealthy stranger rides into town, claiming Lark as his stolen bride and demanding Silas's life as payment. What follows is a deadly game of survival where a broken man must choose between the safety of surrender and the dangerous path of protecting a woman whose past may destroy them all. But what terrible secret is Lark hiding that made her flee from a life of luxury into the arms of a struggling stranger? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dawn broke grey and bitter over the Brandt homestead, casting long shadows across the snow-covered fields that stretched toward the distant mountains. Silas pulled his worn coat tighter as he stepped from the cabin, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The silence was profound here, broken only by the occasional crack of settling timber and the whisper of wind through the bare cottonwoods that lined the creek. 3 winters had passed since Sarah died, and the land seemed to remember her absence in every detail. The vegetable garden she had tended with such care now lay buried beneath 2 feet of snow. The fence posts she had painted a cheerful yellow, now weathered to grey splinters. Even the chickens seemed fewer, as if they too understood that hope had died with the woman who once scattered corn for them each morning with a song on her lips. Silas made his way to the barn, his boots crunching through the crusted snow. The structure leaned slightly to the east, another repair he couldn't afford to make properly. Inside, his breath steamed as he checked on the livestock that represented what little remained of his prosperity. 2 horses, both aging, but still strong enough for farm work. A handful of cattle that had survived the harsh winter better than he'd dared hope. A milk cow whose production had dropped significantly since the good hay ran out in January. As he worked through the morning chores, muscle memory guided his movements while his mind wandered to darker places. The letter he'd written 3 months. Ego sat heavy in his thoughts. A desperate plea sent east to a matrimonial agency in Chicago. He could still remember the weight of the pen in his calloused hand as he'd struggled to find words that might convince a woman to leave civilization for this god-forsaken corner of Montana Territory. Widower seeks wife for companionship and assistance with homestead and child care, he had written, the formal words feeling foreign on his tongue. Comfortable cabin, productive land, honest work available for the right woman. He had not mentioned the mounting debts, the failed crops, or the way the townspeople crossed themselves when they saw him coming. The sound of coughing from the cabin drew him back to the present. Emma, his 8-year-old daughter, had been battling the same persistent chest cold for weeks now. Without Sarah's knowledge of healing herbs and remedies, Silas felt helpless, watching his child grow paler and thinner with each passing day. The doctor in town charged more than Silas could afford for a house call, and the journey to town in this weather might kill Emma faster than the sickness itself. He finished the morning milking and gathered the few eggs the hens had managed to produce. Inside the cabin, Emma sat wrapped in quilts near the stone fireplace, her small frame almost disappearing beneath the layers of fabric. Her hair, once as golden as her mother's, had lost its luster, and her blue eyes seemed too large for her thin face. "Good morning, little bird," Silas said softly, using the pet name Sarah had given their daughter. "How are you feeling today?" Emma managed. A weak smile. "Better, Papa. Did the chickens lay any eggs?" 3, he said, holding up the basket. "Enough for breakfast, with a little left over." As he prepared their simple meal, Silas's gaze fell on the small wooden box that sat on the mantel above. The fireplace. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded silk, lay Sarah's wedding ring, a simple band of gold that had belonged to her grandmother. He had placed it there the day after the funeral, unable to bear keeping it, but equally unable to part with it permanently. The ring represented everything he had lost and everything he feared losing still. Sarah had been his anchor in this harsh land, the reason he had believed they could build something lasting here. Without her steady presence, her gentle wisdom, and her unwavering faith in their future, the homestead felt more like a prison than a home. Emma's coughing fit interrupted his brooding. He moved quickly to her side, helping her sit up straighter, until the spasm passed. When she finally caught her breath, she looked up at him with those two knowing eyes that reminded him so painfully of her mother. "Papa," she said quietly, "when is the lady coming?" Silas had told her about the letter, about the possibility of a new woman joining their household. He had tried to explain it in terms an 8-year-old could understand, that they needed help, that it would be good to have someone else around to care for her when he had to work the land. "Soon, I hope," he said, though doubt gnawed at him. It had been 3 months since he'd sent the letter and his meager payment to the agency. Perhaps no woman in her right mind would willingly travel to such an isolated place to marry a man she'd never met. Perhaps he was truly as cursed as the townspeople whispered. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and reminding him that spring was still months away. In this unforgiving land, time moved differently, measured not in days, but in survival. The town of Cedar Falls had seen better days, though those days seemed like distant memories now. What had once been a thriving community of 200 souls had dwindled to barely half that number as homesteaders abandoned their claims and moved on to more promising territories. The main street, which had bustled with activity during the brief silver boom of the early 70s, now stretched empty and windswept between buildings that sagged under the weight of accumulated snow and neglect. Silas guided his wagon down the rutted main thoroughfare, the wheels creaking in protest against the frozen ground. He had made this journey into town once a month for supplies, though each trip seemed to cost more while his ability to pay steadily diminished. The general store, Kellerman's Mercantile, still maintained a coat of paint that hadn't completely peeled away, making it one of the more prosperous-looking establishments on the street. Inside, the familiar smell of coffee, leather, and wood smoke greeted him. Heinrich Kellerman looked up from behind the counter, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly when he recognized his customer. The German immigrant had been fair enough in his dealings with Silas, but even Kellerman couldn't hide the wariness that seemed to follow Silas wherever he went these days. "Morning, Silas," Kellerman said, his accent still thick after 15 years in Montana territory. "What can I do for you today?" Silas pulled out his carefully written list, items he needed, desperately but could barely afford. "Coffee, flour, salt if you have it, some lamp oil," and he hesitated, knowing the next item would raise questions. "Some of that cough syrup, if you've got any left." Kellerman's weathered face creased with concern. "The little one still sick?" "Been fighting it for weeks now." Silas watched as the shopkeeper gathered the items, each one representing a small fortune to a man in his circumstances. "Dr. Henley still charging $5 for a house call?" "More, last I heard. Town council raised his rate after the widow Morrison couldn't pay what she owed." Kellerman paused in his gathering, fixing Silas with a direct look. "You know, my Martha, she has some knowledge of healing remedies. Learned from her grandmother back in the old country. She might take a look at Emma, no charge." The offer surprised Silas. Since Sarah's death, most of the townspeople had kept their distance, as if misfortune might be contagious. "That's kind of you, Heinrich. I might take you up on that." As Kellerman tallied the purchases, the bell above the door chimed, and Pastor Williamson entered, stamping snow from his boots. The minister was a thin man in his 50s, with the kind of piercing grey eyes that seemed to look right through a person's flesh to examine their soul. He nodded curtly to Silas before approaching the counter. "Afternoon, Pastor," Kellerman said. "The usual order ready for pickup?" "Indeed, though I wanted to ask." Williamson's gaze shifted to Silas. There are rumors circulating about a woman coming to stay at the Brant place. Is there truth to these stories? Silas felt heat rise in his cheeks. News traveled fast in a small town, especially news that provided fresh material for gossip. I've corresponded with a matrimonial agency back east. Nothing's certain yet. The pastor's expression remained neutral, but Silas caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Marriage is a sacred institution, Brother Brant, one that shouldn't be entered into lightly, particularly with strangers. Sarah's been gone 3 years, Pastor. Emma needs a mother, and Silas struggled to find words that wouldn't sound defensive. A man can't run a homestead and raise a child alone, not properly. The Lord provides for those who trust in his plan, Williamson said, though his tone suggested he found Silas's faith wanting. Perhaps this hardship is meant to teach patience and reliance on divine providence rather than worldly solutions. Heinrich Kellerman cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly wishing to avoid the tension that had suddenly filled his store. Total comes to $6.40, Silas. The sum hit Silas like a physical blow. He had hoped it would be closer to $5, money he could barely spare. He counted out the coins slowly, each one representing hours of backbreaking. Labor or items sold that he could ill afford to lose. As he gathered his purchases, Pastor Williamson spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. The registry shows 13 families have abandoned their claims in the past 2 years, Silas. Good Christian families who came here with honest intentions. This land tests a man's faith, and not all are found worthy of its blessings. The implication hung heavy in the air. Silas understood the subtext. His struggles were a reflection of some moral failing, some lack of righteousness that had brought divine displeasure upon his household. It was a sentiment he had heard whispered behind his back for months now. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving snow horizontally down the empty street. As Silas loaded his supplies into the wagon, he caught sight of other townspeople watching from windows and doorways. Their expressions ranged from pity to suspicion, but none offered the warmth of genuine community that he remembered from better times. The ride home passed in brooding silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the steady plodding of his horse through the snow. Cedar Falls felt less like home with each visit, more like a place where he was tolerated rather than welcomed. The thought of bringing a stranger into this environment of judgment and whispered condemnation filled him with unease. Yet what choice did he have? Winter was far from over, Emma grew weaker each day, and the land demanded more than one man could give. Whatever the townspeople thought of his unconventional solution, survival had to take precedence over their approval. The fire crackled softly in the stone hearth as Silas sat beside Emma's bed, watching her sleep. Her breathing seemed easier. Tonight, though the pallor in her cheeks remained a constant source of worry. In the dancing shadows cast by the flames, he could almost see Sarah moving about the cabin, tending to their daughter with the gentle efficiency that had made their home feel complete. Sarah had been barely 18 when they married, a minister's daughter from Illinois, who had answered his advertisement in a Chicago newspaper. Unlike his current desperate circumstances, Silas had been a man of some promise then, young, strong, with money saved from 3 years of railroad work and a valid claim to 160 acres of Montana territory. His letter had painted an honest but hopeful picture of frontier life, and Sarah's response had been filled with the kind of adventurous spirit that made a woman willing to travel 2,000 miles to marry a stranger. He remembered the day she arrived at the Cedar Falls station, stepping down from the dusty stagecoach with a small trunk and a smile that lit up her entire face. She wore a blue dress with tiny white flowers, and her golden hair was pinned back in a style that seemed too elegant for the rough frontier town. Yet she had looked around with genuine curiosity rather than the disappointment he had feared, as if she saw possibilities where others might see only hardship. Their courtship had been brief but genuine, Unlike the arrangement he now desperately sought, theirs had grown into real affection within weeks of her arrival. Sarah possessed a quick wit and a gift for finding beauty in the harsh landscape. She could identify wildflowers by name, turn a simple meal into something special with herbs she gathered herself, and make their one-room cabin feel like a palace with nothing more than careful arrangement and loving attention. The first summer had been magical. Together they had expanded the cabin, adding the second room where Emma now slept, and Sarah had insisted on real glass windows instead of oiled paper. She had planted the garden with seeds brought from Illinois, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn soil through sheer determination and knowledge passed down from her mother. In the evenings, she would read aloud from the few books they owned, while Silas worked on furniture or mended harnesses by lamplight. Emma had been born the following spring, arriving during a late snowstorm that had trapped them in the cabin. For 3 days, Sarah had faced childbirth with the same quiet courage she brought to every challenge, though Silas had never felt so helpless as during those long hours when he could do nothing but hold her hand and pray. When Emma finally entered the world, red-faced and squalling, Sarah had looked at their daughter with such pure love that Silas felt his own heart might burst from the sheer fullness of it. Those had been the golden years when everything seemed possible. The homestead flourished under their combined efforts. Silas proved skilled at breeding cattle, building his herd through careful selection and good grazing management. Sarah's garden produced enough vegetables to feed them through. The winter with surplus to trade in town, Emma grew from infant to toddler to walking child, filling their home with laughter and the kind of innocent chatter that made even the hardest days worthwhile. Sarah had possessed an intuitive understanding of frontier medicine, knowledge gleaned from conversations with other women and careful observation of what worked. She could treat everything from simple cuts to serious fevers, and neighbors often sought her advice when the doctor was unavailable. Her wooden medicine chest, now gathering dust on a high shelf, had once been filled with carefully prepared tinctures and salves that seemed to heal through love as much as herbs, but it was Emma's wooden doll that captured the essence of those better times most perfectly. Carved by Sarah during her last winter, it was a simple thing, smooth wood shaped into human form with painted features that somehow managed to convey both innocence and wisdom. Sarah had worked on it in the evenings, her hands moving with practiced skill while she hummed old hymns or told stories about her own childhood. She had presented it to Emma on Christmas morning, just weeks before the influenza that would claim her life took hold. The doll now sat on Emma's bedside table, its painted face watching over the sleeping child like a guardian angel. Emma clutched it during the worst of her coughing fits, as if drawing strength from this last gift her mother had given her. For Silas, it represented everything he had lost, the gentle hands that had crafted it, the loving heart that had inspired its creation, and the bright future that had died with Sarah. Winter had taken Sarah with brutal efficiency. What started as a simple cold became something more serious, then desperate, then final. Silas had ridden through a blizzard to fetch the doctor, but by the time they returned, Sarah was beyond earthly help. She had died holding Emma's hand, her last words a whispered plea for him to take care of their daughter and not lose heart. The 3 years since her death felt longer than all the happy years combined. Without Sarah's knowledge and gentle touch, the garden had failed. Without her skill at preserving and managing their food stores, winter became a season of bare survival rather than cozy comfort. Without her ability to turn their simple cabin into a home, it had become merely a shelter against the elements. Most devastating of all, without Sarah's gift for healing, Silas watched helplessly as Emma's health declined. Every cough, every fever, every moment of weakness reminded him of his inadequacy as both father and caregiver. The wooden doll served as a constant reminder of what they had lost and what Emma still needed, a mother's love and a woman's practical wisdom. The The February sun hung low and pale in the sky as Silas made his way back from town, his wagon loaded, with the monthly supplies that would have to last until spring truly arrived. The journey had taken longer than usual. The road was treacherous with ice, and his horse moved carefully to avoid the deeper ruts that could snap an axle or lame an animal. Emma had been sleeping when he left before dawn, her breathing still, labored but steady enough that he felt safe leaving her for the necessary trip. As the familiar outline of his homestead came into view, Silas felt the usual mixture of relief and resignation that marked his return from town. Relief to be away from the judgment and whispered conversations that seemed to follow him everywhere. Resignation at the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same struggles as yesterday. The cabin looked small and lonely against the vast expanse of snow-covered prairie, a single point of human habitation in an otherwise empty landscape. He guided the wagon toward the barn, planning to unload the supplies before tending to the evening chores. But as he drew closer, something seemed different about the wagon bed. The canvas tarp he had used to cover his purchases appeared disturbed, as if someone had moved it and then tried to replace it. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle that rested beside him on the wagon seat as he scanned the area for signs of trouble. Then he heard it, a soft sound that might have been the wind, but carried a distinctly human quality. A sigh, perhaps, or the whisper of fabric moving against wood. Silas brought the wagon to a complete stop and listened intently. There it was, again, coming from beneath the tarp that covered the wagon bed. Moving slowly and quietly, he climbed down from the driver's seat and approached the back of the wagon. With one hand on his rifle and the other reaching for the canvas, he pulled back the covering to reveal what lay beneath. A woman was curled among his supplies, sleeping so deeply that his movements hadn't disturbed her. She was small and dark-haired, wrapped in a thin cloak that provided inadequate protection against the cold. Her face, peaceful in sleep, showed signs of exhaustion and perhaps hardship, though her features were refined in a way that spoke of better circumstances in the past. Beside her lay a worn leather satchel and what appeared to be a small book. For a long moment Silas simply stared, his mind struggling to process this unexpected discovery. How had she gotten into his wagon? When? He had been in town for several hours, conducting his business at the mercantile and speaking briefly with Heinrich Kellerman about his wife's offer to examine Emma. The wagon had been unattended for perhaps an hour while he visited the feed store and checked on the possibility of credit for spring seed. The woman stirred slightly, and Silas caught a glimpse of a letter clutched in her gloved hand. Even from a distance, he could make out his own name written in careful script across the envelope. Understanding began to dawn, bringing with it a mixture of amazement and apprehension. This had to be the mail-order bride he had requested through the matrimonial agency. But how had she found his wagon? How long had she been traveling, and why was she sleeping in the back of his supply wagon rather than presenting herself properly at his door? As if sensing his scrutiny, the woman's eyes fluttered open. They were green, he noticed, and held an intelligence that was immediately apparent, even in her state of disorientation. For a moment, she looked around in confusion, taking in her surroundings, and the tall man standing over her with a rifle in his hands. Forgive me, she said, her voice soft but clear. Are you Silas Brandt? I am. He lowered the rifle, but didn't set it aside completely. And you would be? Lark Whitcomb. She struggled to sit up among the flour sacks and bundles of supplies. I believe you were expecting me, though perhaps not quite like this. Silas helped her climb down from the wagon, noting how unsteady she seemed on her feet. She was younger than he had expected, probably no more than 25, and carried herself with a dignity that seemed at odds with her current circumstances. I sent word that I was coming, she continued, clutching her satchel and the mysterious letter. But when I arrived in Cedar Falls, they told me you had already left for home. I took the liberty of waiting in your wagon. I hope you don't mind. Her explanation raised more questions than it answered, but the wind was picking up, and Emma would be waking soon. Whatever story this woman had to tell could wait until they were inside where it was warm. "Come," he said simply. "Let's get you out of this cold." The cabin felt smaller with 3 people in it, though Lark Whitcomb seemed to take up little space as she stood near the door, still clutching her worn satchel. She had declined Silas's offer to help with her belongings, and now she surveyed the modest interior with an expression that was difficult to read. Emma had awakened at the sound of voices and sat up in her bed, studying the stranger with the frank curiosity of childhood. "This is my daughter, Emma," Silas said, breaking the awkward silence that had settled over them. "Emma, this is Miss Whitcomb. She's come to help us." Lark moved closer to the child's bedside, her manner gentle but cautious. "Hello, Emma. Your father tells me you haven't been feeling well." Emma nodded solemnly, her thin fingers wrapped around her wooden doll. "I have a cough that won't go away. Papa says it's because of the winter, but I think it's because Mama went to heaven and took all the warm feelings with her." The simple statement hung in the air, revealing more about their family's grief than any adult explanation could have managed. Lark's green eyes softened, and she glanced at Silas with something that might have been understanding. "Sometimes when we lose someone we love, it does feel like the world gets colder," Lark said quietly. "But the warm feelings don't really leave. They just hide for a while, waiting for the right moment to come back." As evening settled around them, Silas found himself observing this woman who had appeared so unexpectedly in his life. She moved through the cabin with careful efficiency, accepting his offer of coffee and a simple meal of bread and preserved meat. Her manners spoke of education and refinement, yet she seemed comfortable enough in these humble surroundings. When he offered her Sarah's chair by the fire, she hesitated for a long moment before accepting. The gesture felt significant to both of them, though neither spoke of it directly. Instead, they engaged in the careful conversation of strangers learning to navigate shared space. "The journey from Chicago was difficult," Lark said, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if drawing warmth from the ceramic. "The weather turned bad just past Billings, and we were delayed for several days." "You came alone?" Silas asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Yes, I prefer to travel independently when possible." Something in her tone suggested there was more to that story, but she didn't elaborate. As they talked, Silas began to notice details that surprised him. When Emma had another coughing fit, Lark immediately moved to help her sit up and breathe more easily, her movements suggesting familiarity with caring for the sick. When she noticed the poor seal around one of the windows, she mentioned it casually, but with the knowledge of someone who understood how such details affected a household's warmth and comfort. Most intriguingly, she carried a small Bible in her satchel, the leather worn smooth from handling. But when she thought no one was looking, Silas caught her touching it with an expression that seemed more anxious than devout, as if seeking reassurance rather than comfort. "I should mention," Silas said as the evening wore on, "the arrangements we discussed in our correspondence. I don't expect anything immediate. You'll want time to settle in, to see if this life suits you." Lark nodded, relief evident in her posture. "I appreciate your understanding. This is all quite different from what I'm accustomed to." What were you accustomed to? The question came out before he could stop himself, and he immediately regretted its directness. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Fear, perhaps, or pain. "I lived with relatives in Chicago," she said carefully, "but circumstances changed, and I found it necessary to seek alternative arrangements." The explanation felt incomplete, but Silas recognized the tone of someone who had shared as much as they were willing to share. He had his own painful memories that he preferred to keep private. That night, as Lark settled into the small storage room that Silas had hastily prepared with blankets and a makeshift bed, the cabin felt different. Not quite like a home again, but less like a mausoleum of memories. Emma had smiled more in one evening than she had in weeks, and the sound of another woman's voice had brought a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. But as Silas lay in his own bed, listening to the wind howl around the cabin, walls, he couldn't shake the feeling that Lark Whitcomb was running from something. The way she had appeared in his wagon, the careful way she chose her words, the anxious way she touched that worn Bible, all of it suggested a woman with secrets that die. Question that kept him awake was whether those secrets would bring salvation or destruction to what remained of his family. The morning brought a brittle clarity to the Montana landscape, with sunlight glinting off snow that crunched underfoot like broken glass. Lark had risen before dawn, and Silas found her already dressed and moving quietly about the cabin when he emerged from his room. She had managed to rekindle the fire and put coffee on to brew without waking Emma, a small consideration that spoke to her awareness of the household's rhythms. "You didn't need to do that," Silas said, though he was grateful for the warmth and the rich smell of coffee that filled the cabin. "Old habits," she replied, and something in her tone suggested that rising early had been a necessity rather than a choice in her previous life. Over the following days, a tentative routine began to establish itself. Lark proved surprisingly capable. Around the homestead, though her skills seemed to come from observation rather than experience, she watched carefully as Silas tended the animals, asking thoughtful questions about their care and feeding. When he showed her how to milk the cow, her hands were gentle but uncertain, as if she had read about such tasks but never performed them. It was with Emma that Lark's true abilities became apparent. The child had taken to her immediately, perhaps, sensing in this quiet woman something she had been missing since her mother's death. Lark seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of how to comfort a sick child, knowing when to encourage Emma to eat and when to let her rest, when to entertain her with stories and when to simply sit quietly nearby. "Tell me about the angels." Again, Emma would whisper during her worst coughing spells, and Lark would speak in soft tones about beings of light who watched over children and carried their prayers to heaven. Her stories were detailed and vivid, suggesting either a deep religious education or an active imagination that had been well exercised. One afternoon, while Silas worked on repairing a broken harness, he overheard Lark reading to Emma from her worn Bible. But instead of the familiar passages he expected, she was telling the story of Ruth and Naomi, about a woman who left everything familiar to follow someone else's family into an uncertain future. The choice of story seemed deliberate, as if Lark was trying to understand her own situation through the lens of ancient narrative. "Why did Ruth go with Naomi?" Emma asked. "Wasn't she scared to leave her home?" "I think she was very scared," Lark said, thoughtfully. "But sometimes staying in a place that seems safe can be more dangerous than leaving for somewhere unknown. Sometimes we have to trust that the path we're meant to walk will reveal itself as we go." Later that evening, when Emma had finally fallen asleep, Silas found Lark sitting by the fire with something small pressed between the pages of her Bible. In the flickering light, he caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a dried flower, something delicate and once beautiful, now preserved like a memory. "A forget-me-not," she said when she noticed his attention, "from a garden I used to tend." "In Chicago?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Before Chicago, when I was younger and thought I understood what my life would become." The flower was tiny, its blue petals faded to pale grey, but she handled it with the reverence usually reserved for precious jewels. Whatever memory it represented seemed both treasured and painful, a connection to a past she couldn't quite bring herself to leave behind. "We all make plans that don't work out the way we expect," Silas said gently. "The trick is learning to make new ones. Is that what you're doing? Making new plans?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. "I'm trying to, for Emma's sake, if not my own." As the weeks passed, small moments of connection began to accumulate between them. Lark's presence in the cabin brought a kind of peace that Silas hadn't realized he was missing. Not the passionate love he had shared with Sarah, but something quieter, a sense of partnership in the daily struggle of survival. She proved remarkably resourceful in ways that continued to surprise him. When Emma developed a fever, Lark mixed a remedy from herbs she somehow knew to look for among Silas's limited supplies. When a winter storm trapped them inside for 3 days, she organized activities that kept Emma entertained and distracted from her illness. When their food stores ran lower than expected, she suggested ways to stretch their meals that spoke of experience with scarcity. Yet for all her helpfulness, Lark remained an enigma. She flinched when doors slammed unexpectedly. She always positioned herself where she could see both the entrance and the windows. At night, Silas sometimes heard her moving restlessly in her small room, as if sleep brought dreams she preferred to avoid. The pressed flower seemed to be her most precious possession, more valued even than the Bible that held it. Sometimes he would catch her looking at it with an expression of such profound sadness that he wondered what tragedy had forced her to leave that earlier garden behind. But gradually, he began to notice changes in her as well. The lines of tension around her eyes softened slightly. She smiled more easily, especially when Emma made her laugh with childish observations. The way she moved through the cabin became less careful, more natural, as if she was beginning to believe that this might truly be a place where she could belong. The fragile bond growing between them felt as delicate as that pressed flower, something that needed careful tending if it was going to survive the harsh realities of frontier life. March brought the first hints of spring to the Montana Territory, though winter still held the land in its grip, with occasional blizzards that reminded everyone not to trust the warming sun too quickly. Lark had been with them for nearly a month now, and while she had settled into the rhythm of their daily life, certain inconsistencies in her story had begun to trouble Silas. It started with small things, the way she handled fine china when they ate their simple meals, as if such delicate items were familiar to her. The precise way she spoke, with diction that suggested education far beyond what most frontier women possessed. Most tellingly, there were moments when she forgot to be careful about her past, letting slip references to things that didn't align with her claimed background as a minister's daughter from modest circumstances. One afternoon, while sorting through her few belongings to do washing, Silas discovered something that made him pause. Hidden in the lining of her traveling bag was a torn piece of what appeared to be an expensive photograph, the kind taken in fine studios in eastern cities. The fragment showed part of an elegant dress and a woman's hand, wearing what looked like a substantial ring. The photographic paper was of high quality, and the clothing visible in the portion that remained spoke of wealth and social position. When he mentioned finding the photograph that evening, Lark's reaction was immediate and telling. Color drained from her face, and her hands trembled slightly as she took the fragment from him. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing something that looked very much like fear. "It's nothing important," she said quickly, but her voice carried none of its usual steadiness. "Just a memento from before." "Before what, Lark?" Silas asked gently. "I've been patient about your past, but I'm starting to think there are things you haven't told me, things that might be important for me to know." She was quiet for so long that he wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her words came carefully, as if she was weighing each one before allowing it voice. "I told you I lived with relatives in Chicago," she began. "That was true, but not complete. My circumstances there were complicated. I was engaged to be married to a man my guardian chose for me, a wealthy man with substantial business interests. The admission hung between them like a physical presence." Silas felt his stomach tighten as he began to understand the implications of what she was telling him. "What happened to change that?" he asked, though he suspected he might not want to hear the answer. "I discovered things about him that made marriage impossible. His wealth came from ventures that caused harm to others. His treatment of those beneath his social station was—" she struggled to find words. I couldn't bind myself to such a man, regardless of the financial security it would provide. So you ran away. I left, she corrected, as if the distinction mattered. I fulfilled my obligation to consider his proposal, and then I chose a different path. But even as she spoke, Silas could see that she wasn't telling him everything. There was something more, something that had driven her not just to reject this wealthy suitor, but to flee so completely that she had sought out a mail-order arrangement with a complete stranger on the frontier. That night, he heard her crying, softly in her small room. The sound was heartbreaking in its quiet desperation, as if she was grieving for something lost or afraid of something that might still find her. He wanted to comfort her, but they hadn't yet reached the point in their relationship where such intimacy would be welcome. The next morning brought troubling news from town. When Heinrich Kellerman made his weekly delivery of supplies to the more remote homesteads, he mentioned that strangers had been asking questions in Cedar Falls. Well-dressed men who seemed to have money to spend and specific interest in whether any new women had arrived in the area recently. They claimed to be railroad surveyors, Heinrich told Silas as he unloaded flour and coffee. But they asked too many questions about personal matters for men supposedly interested in land rights and roots. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What kind of questions? About mail-order brides? About women traveling alone? They seemed particularly interested in anyone who might have come from back east in the past few months. Heinrich paused in his work to fix Silas with a concerned look. They mentioned your name specifically. The news confirmed Silas's growing suspicion that Lark's past was catching up with her, and that her presence on his homestead might bring danger to them all. When he shared Heinrich's information with Lark that evening, her reaction told him everything he needed to know about the seriousness of their situation. She went pale as moonlight, and her hand moved instinctively to her throat, as if she couldn't quite catch her breath. The torn photograph trembled in her fingers as she clutched it like a talisman against approaching doom. "He found me," she whispered, and in those 3 words, Silas heard the sound of their fragile peace beginning to shatter. The knowledge that someone was actively searching for Lark changed everything between them. What had been a cautious arrangement born of mutual necessity transformed into something deeper as they found themselves bound together by shared danger. In the days following Heinrich's warning, Silas noticed how Lark watched the horizon with anxious eyes, and how she startled at every unexpected sound. It was during this tense period that their relationship began to shift from polite cooperation to genuine intimacy. Faced with the possibility that their time together might be limited, both seemed determined to make the most of whatever peace they could find. Silas found himself working closer to the cabin, reluctant to leave Lark and Emma alone for extended periods. Lark, meanwhile, threw herself into domestic tasks with an intensity that suggested she was trying to create as much normalcy as possible before it was taken away. One evening, as they sat by the fire after Emma had fallen asleep, Silas began working on a piece of wood with his carving tools. The rhythmic scraping of knife against pine seemed to calm them both, providing a peaceful counterpoint to the wind that howled around the cabin walls. Lark watched his hands as he worked, fascinated by the way rough lumber gradually took shape. Under his patient attention, "What are you making?" she asked softly. "A horse," he replied, holding up the partially carved figure. "Emma mentioned that her doll might like a companion, something to ride when she goes on adventures." The gesture was simple, but Lark seemed to understand its deeper significance. In the midst of their uncertainty, Silas was still thinking about his daughter's happiness, still believing in a future where such small gifts would matter. "You have gentle hands," she observed. "I wouldn't have expected that from a man who works such hard land." Sarah used to say the same thing. He paused in his carving, remembering. She said a man who could make beautiful things from rough wood would always find a way to create something good, no matter how difficult the circumstances. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was, But wisdom doesn't protect you from influenza or harsh winters or the 100 other things that can go wrong out here. His voice carried the weight of old grief, but also something new, a tentative hope that perhaps he might find happiness again. As the evenings passed, their conversations grew more personal. Lark began to share memories of her childhood, carefully edited stories that revealed glimpses of a privileged upbringing she had tried to leave behind. She spoke of tutors and music lessons, of gardens where she had learned to tend flowers, of books that had opened worlds beyond her immediate experience. "I always thought I would have my own garden someday," she said one night, watching Silas add details to the wooden horse. "Somewhere I could grow things that existed purely for their beauty, not just their usefulness." "You could have that here," Silas said carefully. "When spring truly arrives, we could clear a space for flowers. Emma would love to help plant them." The offer hung between them, heavy with implications about permanence and shared futures. Lark's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "That's a beautiful thought," she whispered, "but I'm not sure I have the right to make such plans." It was then that Silas set down his carving tools and really looked at her. This woman who had appeared in his wagon like an answer to prayer, and who now seemed poised to disappear just as mysteriously. In the firelight, her face showed the strain of carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear alone. "Lark," he said gently, "whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, you have a choice about what happens next. You're not just a victim of circumstances beyond your control, aren't I?" She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You don't know what he's capable of, what he's already done to ensure I fulfill the obligations he believes I owe him. Then tell me, help me understand what we're facing." For a moment, he thought she might finally share the whole truth, but then Emma coughed in her sleep, and the sound seemed to remind Lark of how much more than her own safety was at stake. Instead of confessing her deepest secrets, she reached out and touched the wooden horse Silas had been carving. "It's beautiful," she said, changing the subject with deliberate care. "Emma will treasure it." But as she spoke, her fingers lingered on the smooth wood, tracing the curves he had shaped with such patient attention. The touch seemed to calm her, as if the simple act of connecting with something he had created offered a kind of peace she rarely allowed herself. "I've never had anyone make something just for my happiness," she admitted quietly. "Everything beautiful in my life before this came with obligations or expectations attached." The confession revealed more about her past than any of her carefully guarded stories had managed. Silas understood then that whatever wealth and privilege she had known, it had come at a cost that made his humble cabin seem rich by comparison. That night, as they prepared for bed, Lark paused at the door to her small room and looked back at him with an expression that held both gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you," she said simply, "for the horse, for the offer of a garden, for treating me like someone worthy of beautiful things." After she disappeared into her room, Silas sat by the dying fire and finished the carving, adding tiny details that would make Emma smile. But as he worked, he found himself thinking not just about his daughter's joy, but about the woman who had been denied such simple pleasures for too long. The wooden horse represented more than a child's toy. It was a symbol of the kind of life they might build together if they could find a way to outrun the shadows of Lark's past. April arrived with false promises of warmth, bringing days that hinted at spring, before plunging back into winter's grip without warning. The unpredictable weather seemed to mirror the tension that had settled over the Brandt homestead as news from town grew increasingly ominous. Heinrich Kellerman's weekly visits now brought reports of continued inquiries from the well-dressed strangers, and their questions had grown more specific and more urgent. It was during one of these visits that Lark's worst fears began to take concrete shape. Heinrich arrived looking unusually grave, his normally cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious concern. He declined Silas's usual offer of coffee and instead asked to speak with him privately, outside the cabin. The men asking questions. Heinrich began without preamble. They're not railroad surveyors. Pastor Williamson received a telegram at the church office yesterday. Someone back east is offering a substantial reward for information about a missing woman. Silas felt his blood turn cold. How substantial? More money than most folks in Cedar Falls see in a year, and they provided a description that... Heinrich glanced toward the cabin where Lark was tending to Emma. It matches your mail-order bride rather precisely. The weight of this news settled over Silas like a physical burden. A reward of that magnitude would turn even friendly neighbors into potential enemies. In a struggling frontier town where every family faced financial hardship, such a sum represented security that few could afford to ignore. There's more, Heinrich continued reluctantly. The telegram mentioned legal documents, claims of breach of contract, theft of property. Whoever is looking for her has lawyers involved, and they're threatening to involve territorial authorities if she isn't returned voluntarily. That evening, Silas shared Heinrich's warning with Lark, watching as each piece of information seemed to drain more color from her face. When he finished, she sat in silence for several long minutes, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white. "How long do you think we have?" she asked finally. "Not long. Money talks loud in a place like Cedar Falls, especially when it's accompanied by legal threats." Lark reached into her dress and withdrew something she had kept hidden until now, a silver locket that caught the firelight and threw tiny rainbows across the cabin walls. The piece was clearly valuable, ornate in a way that spoke of wealth and refined taste. She opened it to reveal a miniature portrait of a young woman who looked remarkably like Lark herself, though dressed in clothes that suggested an earlier era. "This was my mother's," she said quietly, "and her mother's before that. It's the only thing of real value I managed to bring with me when I left Chicago." Silas studied the locket, understanding immediately why she had kept it hidden. Such an obviously expensive piece would have raised questions about her claimed background, and more importantly, it represented the kind of traceable connection that could lead her pursuers directly to her door. "The woman in the portrait," Larky continued, "she faced a similar choice to mine. She was promised in marriage to a man chosen by her family, a man whose wealth was built on suffering and exploitation. But she chose love over security, scandal over safety. What happened to her? She died young. Some said it was her heart, weakened by the stress of defying social convention. Others whispered that her rejected suitor had found ways to make her life so difficult that she simply couldn't continue." Lark's voice grew soft with old sorrow. "I used to think she was foolish to throw away everything for principles. Now I wonder if she was the only one in our family who truly understood what mattered." The locket represented more than family history. It was a symbol of the pattern that seemed to repeat through generations of women in her family, each forced to choose between security and autonomy, wealth and freedom. By wearing it, Lark was claiming kinship with those who had chosen the harder path. "Roland Keene," she said suddenly, and the name fell from her lips like a curse. "That's who's looking for me. He's the man I was supposed to marry, and he doesn't accept defeat gracefully." The name meant nothing to Silas, but the way Lark spoke it told him everything he needed to know about the man's character. This wasn't simply a rejected suitor nursing wounded pride. This was someone with the resources and determination to pursue what he considered his property across half a continent. "What exactly did you do that made him so determined to get you back?" Silas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Lark's hand went to her throat, a gesture he had noticed before when she was particularly distressed. "I discovered something I wasn't supposed to know. Something that would ruin him if it became public knowledge. And he thinks you'll expose him? He knows I will, if he forces me to choose between his reputation and my freedom." The admission changed everything. What Silas had assumed was a simple case of a runaway bride was actually something far more dangerous. A battle of wills between a powerful man and a woman who possessed the knowledge to destroy him. The stakes were higher than he had imagined, and the danger more immediate than he had feared. Outside, the wind began to howl with renewed fury, as if nature itself was warning them that their time of peace was coming to an end. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the morning stillness like a blade, sending ice through Silas's veins as he recognized the deliberate pace of riders who knew exactly where they were going. He had been splitting wood behind the cabin when the noise reached him, and now he stood frozen with the axe in his hands, listening to what sounded like destiny approaching down the frozen trail. Lark must have heard it too, because when he looked toward the cabin, she was already standing in the doorway with Emma behind her, one protective hand on the child's shoulder. Her face had gone pale as winter moonlight, but her posture remained straight and defiant, as if she had always known this moment would come, and had prepared herself to meet it with whatever courage she possessed. 3 riders crested the small rise that led to the homestead, their horses steaming in the cold air. The man in the lead sat his mount with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to having others bend to his will. He was perhaps 35 years old, well dressed in a way that immediately marked him as an outsider in this rough country. His coat was tailored wool, his boots polished leather, and his hat bore none of the practical modifications that frontier life demanded. Everything about him spoke of wealth and power, and the absolute certainty that both would be sufficient to solve any problem he might encounter. Behind him rode 2 men who were clearly hired help, the kind of hard-faced individuals who made their living ensuring that their employers' wishes were carried out regardless of local laws or customs. They wore gun belts with the casual ease of professional violence, and their eyes swept the homestead with the calculating assessment of men evaluating potential resistance. "Mr. Brandt, I presume," the lead rider said as he brought his horse to a stop near the cabin. His voice carried the cultured accent of Eastern education, but underneath lay something cold and implacable. "I am Roland Keene. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Silas stepped forward, still holding the axe, but keeping it low and non-threatening. He could feel the weight of the moment, understanding that how he handled the next few minutes might determine whether anyone left this encounter alive. "Mr. Keene," he replied carefully, "you've traveled a long way. What brings you to Montana territory?" Roland's smile was thin and predatory. "I think we both know the answer to that question. I've come to collect my fiancé and return her to Chicago, where she belongs." From her position in the doorway, Lark finally spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I am not your fiancé, Roland. I never agreed to marry you, and I never will." "Ah, Larkspur," Roland said, using what was apparently her full name with possessive familiarity, "still as stubborn as ever, but I'm afraid your preferences in this matter are irrelevant. We have a binding contract, signed by your legal guardian and witnessed by appropriate authorities." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, extracting several official-looking documents. Even from a distance, Silas could see the impressive seals and formal script that marked them as legal instruments of significant importance. "As you can see," Roland continued, "I have every right to reclaim what was stolen from me. Miss Whitcomb was promised in marriage as part of a business arrangement that has already been consummated financially. Her departure from Chicago represents breach of contract and theft of valuable consideration." "She's not property to be reclaimed," Silas said, his temper beginning to rise despite his efforts to remain calm. "In the eyes of the law, she most certainly is." Roland's tone remained pleasant, but his eyes had gone cold as winter stone. Her guardian accepted substantial payment for her hand in marriage. When she fled without fulfilling her obligations, she became a debtor in default. I have every legal right to pursue recovery of my investment. The casual way he spoke of Lark as an investment rather than a human being made Silas's grip tighten on the axe handle. But before he could respond, Roland continued with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Of course, I'm not unreasonable. I understand that Mr. Brandt here may have been an innocent party in this deception. Larkspur can be quite convincing when she sets her mind to it." His smile was poisonous in its false warmth. "I'm prepared to compensate you for any expenses you may have incurred in housing and feeding my property. Shall we say $50 for your trouble?" The offer was clearly meant to be generous enough to eliminate any principled objections Silas might have too. Surrendering Lark. In Roland's world, every man had a price, and $50 was more than most frontier farmers saw in months of hard work. "She's not for sale," Silas said flatly. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Brandt. It's simply a matter of finding the right price." Roland's pleasant facade began to slip, revealing something darker underneath. "However, if you prefer to be difficult about this, I should mention that I also have a warrant for your arrest on charges of harboring a fugitive and interfering with the lawful recovery of property." The legal documents suddenly felt less like papers and more like weapons, pointed directly at everything Silas had left to lose. Sheriff Thomas Mackenzie arrived at the Brandt homestead within hours of Roland Keene's initial confrontation. His presence, lending official weight to what had previously been a personal dispute. Silas watched from his cabin window as the lawman dismounted and spoke quietly with Roland near the horses, their conversation punctuated by the rustle of papers and the occasional gesture toward the cabin where Lark waited with Emma. Mackenzie had been sheriff of Cedar Falls for 8 years, long enough to earn a reputation for fairness tempered by pragmatism. He was a man who understood that frontier justice sometimes required flexibility in the application of territorial law, but he was also acutely aware that his position depended on maintaining relationships with influential people who could make or break his career. When he finally approached the cabin, his weathered face showed the strain of a man caught between competing obligations. The silver badge pinned to his coat seemed heavier than usual, as if it weighed on him physically as well as morally. "Silas," he said with a nod of greeting that managed to convey both professional duty and personal regret. "I'm afraid we have a situation here that requires official intervention, Sheriff." Silas stepped outside, closing the door behind him to keep Emma from hearing what he suspected would be an unpleasant conversation. "I suppose Mr. Keene has made his case to you." "He has, and I have to tell you, his documentation appears to be in order. These contracts and warrants bear the proper seals and signatures. As far as territorial law is concerned, he has legitimate claim to the woman and grounds for your arrest if you continue to harbor her." The words fell between them like stones, each one carrying the weight of legal inevitability. Mackenzie's tone suggested he took no pleasure in delivering this news, but his duty was clear regardless of his personal feelings. "What exactly is he accusing me of, Tom?" "Interference with the lawful recovery of property, harboring a fugitive debtor, conspiracy to defraud a creditor of his lawful due." Mackenzie's voice grew quieter as he continued. "The penalties for these charges could include substantial fines, imprisonment, and forfeiture of your homestead to cover damages." The threat was comprehensive and devastating. Roland had clearly come prepared not just to reclaim Lark, but to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The loss of the homestead would mean death for Emma, who was too frail to survive another upheaval in her young life. "And if I cooperate? Mr. Keene has indicated he would be willing to overlook your unwitting participation in this matter. He understands that you were deceived by the woman's false representations about her circumstances." The carefully chosen words made Silas's stomach turn. Roland was offering him an escape route that required only the small sacrifice of his principles and Lark's freedom. In the harsh calculus of frontier survival, it might even be the rational choice. From inside the cabin came the sound of Emma's coughing, a reminder of how much more than his own welfare hung in the balance. Sheriff Mackenzie noticed the sound, too, his expression softening with genuine sympathy. "I hear the little one's been poorly," he said quietly. "Martha Kellerman mentioned she might be able to help with some remedies if you're interested." "That's kind of her," Silas appreciated the gesture, but kindness wouldn't solve their current crisis. "Tom, what would you do in my position?" The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "As a lawman, I'd tell you to follow the law and avoid bringing more trouble down on your family. As a man," he glanced toward the cabin where Lark waited with Emma, "as a man, I'd say that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing." It was as close to encouragement as Mackenzie could offer without compromising his position, but it also highlighted the impossible choice Silas faced. Standing up for what was right might mean losing everything he had left, while surrendering to legal pressure would save his homestead at the cost of his soul. "How long do I have to decide? Mr. Keene is a reasonable man. He's willing to give you until tomorrow morning to consider your options and make the right choice." The phrase, "reasonable man," applied to Roland Keene struck Silas as darkly ironic, but he understood the message. 24 hours to choose between survival and principle, between Emma's welfare and Lark's freedom. After Mackenzie left, Silas returned to the cabin to find Lark sitting by Emma's bedside, reading quietly from her worn Bible. The domestic scene was peaceful and normal, a stark contrast to the legal storm gathering outside their door. "What did he say?" Lark asked without looking up from the page. "That Roland has the law on his side, that I could lose everything if I don't cooperate." "Then you should cooperate." Her voice was steady, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "Emma needs you. She needs this home. I won't be responsible for destroying what little security she has left." "And what about what you need?" "What I need doesn't matter anymore." She finally looked at him, and he saw resignation in her green eyes that hurt worse than any physical blow. "I knew this day would come eventually. I just hoped we would have more time." Outside, the wind had begun to howl again, driving snow against the windows with renewed fury. The storm seemed fitting somehow, as if nature itself was responding to the chaos that had invaded their small sanctuary. The sheriff's badge represented more than just law enforcement. It symbolized the weight of authority that could crush individual will beneath the machinery of legal process. And somewhere in town, that authority was being bought and paid for by a man who viewed human beings as property to be reclaimed. That night, as Emma slept fitfully in her bed and the wind rattled the cabin windows, Lark made a decision that would change everything. She could no longer allow Silas and Emma to face destruction because of secrets she had carried alone for too long. The weight of her hidden truth had become unbearable, and the approaching deadline forced her to choose between continued silence and the possibility of salvation through confession. "Silas," she said quietly, drawing his attention from the fire, where he had been staring into the flames with the hollow-eyed look of a man facing impossible choices. "There's something I haven't told you about why I left Chicago. Something that makes Roland's pursuit even more dangerous than you realize." He turned to face her, and she saw in his eyes the same patient gentleness that had drawn her to trust him in the first place. But what she was about to reveal would test that trust beyond anything she had asked of him before. From her dress pocket, she withdrew a small glass vial, no bigger than her thumb. The container was innocuous enough, but the clear liquid inside caught the firelight in a way that seemed somehow ominous. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it, and when she spoke, her voice barely rose above a whisper. "This is laudanum," she said, "but not the kind used for medicinal purposes. This has been concentrated, refined into something far more potent, something deadly." Silas stared at the vial, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. "Lark, what did you do?" "I tried to poison Roland Keene." The words fell from her lips like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread through the very air of the cabin. "I mixed this into his brandy during what was supposed to be our engagement celebration. I wanted him dead, Silas. I planned his murder with the same care other women might use to plan their weddings." The confession hung between them, transforming everything he thought he knew about her. This wasn't simply a woman fleeing an unwanted marriage. This was someone who had attempted murder and failed, someone whose desperation had driven her to the ultimate crime. "What stopped you?" he asked quietly. "Cowardice, perhaps, or providence?" At the last moment, I couldn't watch him drink it. I knocked the glass from his hand, claiming it was an accident, but he's too intelligent not to have suspected something. When he had the brandy analyzed and found the poison, he knew exactly who was responsible. She set the vial on the small table between them, where it seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the firelight. I kept this as evidence of what I had attempted, proof that I was capable of murder, even if I lacked the resolve to complete. Why did you want him dead? What did he do that drove you to such extremes? Lark was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the poison that represented the darkest moment of her life. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of horrors she had tried desperately to forget. Roland's wealth comes from human trafficking. He owns interests in several businesses that appear legitimate on the surface: import companies, shipping concerns, employment agencies. But underneath, they facilitate the movement and sale of desperate people, mostly young women brought from Europe under false promises of honest work. The revelation struck Silas like a physical blow. He had known Roland was unscrupulous, but this was evil on a scale that defied comprehension. "I discovered this by accident," Lark continued. "I was in his study one evening when a telegram arrived from one of his associates. The message was brief, but it made reference to a shipment of merchandise that would be distributed to buyers in various cities. When I asked about it, Roland laughed and explained the nature of his business as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He told you directly? He bragged about it? He seemed to take pleasure in shocking me, in demonstrating the extent of his power over vulnerable people. He showed me ledgers detailing transactions, correspondence with buyers, even photographs of some of the women he had sold." Her voice broke slightly. "He said that once we were married, I would help him expand the operation, that my refinement and education would be useful in recruiting new victims." The vial of poison suddenly seemed less like evidence of attempted murder and more like a desperate attempt at justice. Silas understood now why Lark had been driven to such extremes and why Roland's pursuit was so relentless. "He can't let you live free," Silas said, the full implications becoming clear. "You know too much about his operations." "Exactly. This isn't about a broken engagement or wounded pride. If I remain free, I represent an existential threat to his entire criminal enterprise. He'll never stop hunting me, and he'll destroy anyone who tries to help me." The poison sat between them like a physical manifestation of the evil they faced, a reminder that sometimes good people were driven to contemplate terrible actions when confronted with true wickedness. The morning brought no peace, only the crystalline clarity that sometimes follows a night of terrible revelations. Silas had slept little, his mind churning with the implications of what Lark had told him. The woman he had begun to love was not just fleeing an unwanted marriage. She was the only witness to crimes so monstrous that her continued existence threatened an entire network of human misery. Roland Keene arrived at the homestead shortly after dawn, his demeanor suggesting that patience was a luxury he had exhausted. He no longer bothered with the pretense of civilized negotiation, and the two hired men who flanked him kept their hands close to their weapons in a way that made their intentions unmistakably clear. "Mr. Brandt," Roland called out as he dismounted, "near the cabin. I trust you've had sufficient time to consider your position. I'm here to collect what belongs to me and conclude this unfortunate business." Silas stepped outside, and this time he carried his rifle openly. The weapon felt heavier than usual in his hands, weighted with the knowledge that he might actually need to use it before this confrontation ended. "Miss Whitcomb has made her choice," Silas replied. "She chooses to remain here. Miss Whitcomb's choices are irrelevant." Roland's mask of civility had finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation that lay beneath. "She is bound by legal contract and financial obligation. More importantly, she has something that belongs to me. knowledge that must be contained. The admission was as close to a confession as Roland was likely to make in the presence of witnesses, but it confirmed what Lark had revealed about the true nature of his pursuit. This wasn't about marriage or money, it was about silencing the one person who could expose his criminal empire. "I know what you are," Silas said quietly. "I know what your business really involves, and I know why you can't afford to let her go." Roland's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained controlled. "Knowledge can be dangerous, Mr. Brandt, particularly when possessed by those who lack the wisdom to use it properly." From inside the cabin came the sound of Emma's morning cough, a reminder of the innocent life that hung in the balance. But instead of weakening Silas's resolve, the sound seemed to strengthen it. His daughter deserved to grow up in a world where monsters like Roland Keene couldn't operate with impunity. "Here's what's going to happen," Roland continued, his tone taking on the quality of an ultimatum. "You're going to bring Larkspur outside, and we're going to return to Chicago together. In exchange, I'll forget about your interference and allow you to continue your miserable existence on this worthless patch of ground. And if I refuse, then you'll discover how quickly territorial authorities can seize property belonging to accused criminals. You'll also learn how fragile life can be on the frontier, particularly for isolated families with sick children." The threat was delivered with casual precision, each word calculated for maximum impact. Roland wasn't just threatening Silas, he was threatening Emma, using a father's love as leverage to force compliance. But the threat had the opposite effect than Roland intended. Instead of breaking Silas's resistance, it crystallized his resolve into something harder than the Montana bedrock. Some lines could not be crossed. Some evils could not be tolerated, regardless of the personal cost. "No," Silas said simply. "No." Roland's composure cracked slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe that his carefully constructed web of threats and bribes had failed to produce the desired result. "No, she stays here. You leave, and if you come back, I'll be ready for you." It was then that Lark appeared in the cabin doorway, drawn by the sound of raised voices. In her hand, she carried Sarah's kitchen knife, a simple domestic tool transformed by circumstance into a potential weapon. The blade caught the morning sunlight, throwing reflected light across the yard like a signal of defiance. "Roland," she said, her voice carrying across the distance between them with surprising strength, "you should know that I've written everything down, every detail of your operations, every name, every location. I've hidden multiple copies in places you'll never find them." "You're bluffing," Roland replied, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Am I? You trained me well in the art of careful planning and thorough documentation. Did you think I wouldn't apply those lessons to protecting myself?" The standoff had reached its breaking point. Words had failed, threats had been ignored, and legal pressure had proven insufficient. What remained was the most primitive form of conflict resolution, violence between those who refused to yield. Roland's hand moved toward his coat, where the outline of a pistol was clearly visible. His hired men tensed, ready to follow their employer's lead into bloodshed. The kitchen knife in Lark's hand seemed to pulse with symbolic weight, representing the transformation of their peaceful domestic sanctuary into a battlefield where survival would be determined by willingness to fight rather than submit. The confrontation with Roland ended not with violence, but with a strategic withdrawal that left everyone understanding the true nature of their situation. After Lark's revelation about the hidden documentation, Roland had studied the three of them with the calculating gaze of a predator reassessing prey that had proven more dangerous than expected. Without another word, he had mounted his horse and ridden away with his men, but his parting look promised that this was merely a tactical retreat. "He'll be back," Lark said quietly, as they watched the riders disappear over the ridge. "And next time, he won't bother with legal pretenses or civilized conversation." Silas nodded grimly. Roland's brief appearance had been reconnaissance as much as negotiation, a chance for him to assess the homestead's defenses and the resolve of its defenders. What he had seen would inform whatever plan he developed for his next approach. The homestead deed lay spread across the kitchen table now, its official seals and formal language representing everything Silas had worked to build over the past decade. The document was more than legal proof of ownership. It was the foundation of Emma's security and the tangible representation of dreams he had shared with Sarah. Losing it would mean losing everything that mattered, but keeping it might require defending it with his life. "We need to prepare," Silas said, his voice taking on the measured tone of a man making strategic calculations. "If Roland comes back, it won't be for another conversation." "What can we do against 3 armed men?" Lark asked. "You have your rifle, but they have professional killers. Numbers aren't everything in a fight. This is our ground, and we know it better than they do. We have the advantage of defensive position and the motivation of people fighting for their home." As they planned, Silas found himself drawing on memories. He had tried to forget, lessons learned during his brief service with the territorial militia during the Indian conflicts of the previous decade. Combat skills he had hoped never to use again suddenly became relevant to protecting his family. The cabin's construction offered both advantages and vulnerabilities. The thick log walls would stop most bullets, and the limited number of windows and doors made it easier to defend. But the same features that provided protection also created the risk of being trapped if Roland decided to use fire as a weapon. "We need supplies moved to the root cellar," Silas said, mentally cataloguing their resources. "Food, water, ammunition, and we need to prepare escape routes in case we can't hold the cabin." Lark listened to his planning with growing amazement. This gentle man who carved toys for his daughter was revealing another side of himself. Someone capable of thinking like a soldier when circumstances demanded it. "What about Emma?" she asked. "She's too sick to run and too young to understand what's happening." "The storm cellar behind the cabin. It's partially underground, well hidden, and has its own ventilation. If things go badly, you can take her there and wait, and leave you to face them alone, if necessary." The quiet determination in his voice reminded Lark why she had come to care for this man so deeply. He was prepared to sacrifice himself for her and Emma without hesitation, driven by a sense of honor that seemed almost archaic in its purity. As they worked through the afternoon, moving supplies and checking the cabin's defenses, neighbors began arriving with news from town. Heinrich Kellerman was the first, bringing word that Roland had been seen at the hotel, apparently settling in for an extended stay. Pastor Williamson came next, his usual stern demeanor replaced by obvious concern. "The man's been asking questions." "About you, Silas," the pastor reported, "offering money for information about your habits, your resources, your friends. Some folks are talking." "What kind of talk?" "The kind that comes when a man with gold coins starts suggesting that helping you might be dangerous for their own families." It was exactly what Silas had feared. Roland wasn't just planning a direct assault. He was working to isolate them by turning the community against them through a combination of bribes and threats. But not everyone in Cedar Falls was susceptible to such pressure. Martha Kellerman arrived as evening approached, carrying a basket that contained more than food. Hidden beneath the bread and preserves were additional cartridges for Silas's rifle and a small pistol that had belonged to her late father. "Heinrich doesn't know I brought the gun," she said quietly. "He worries about getting involved in other people's troubles, but some things are worth the risk." As darkness fell, other quiet supporters made themselves known. Tom Bradley, who owned the farm to the east, stopped by to mention that he would be keeping watch from his property and would signal if he saw riders approaching. Mary Sullivan, the schoolteacher, brought word that she had written letters to territorial authorities in Helena, describing Roland's threats and requesting official protection. The network of support was fragile and limited, but it existed. Not everyone in Cedar Falls was willing to trade their neighbors' lives for Roland's money. That night, as they maintained watch by the windows, Silas reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he had been a broken widower, facing slow starvation on a failing homestead. Now he was preparing to fight for a woman who had become precious to him and a future that seemed worth defending. The homestead deed lay on the table beside his rifle, both representing different aspects of what he was fighting for. One symbolized the past and the foundation of his life with Sarah. The other represented the means to protect the future he hoped to build with Lark and Emma. Tomorrow would likely bring the ultimate test of whether that future was possible. Dawn broke grey and ominous over the Montana landscape, bringing with it a sense of finality that seemed to settle over the homestead like morning frost. Silas had spent the night in restless vigil, moving between windows and checking the approaches to the cabin with the methodical patience of a man who understood that survival often depended on attention to small details. Emma's condition had worsened during the night, her breathing more labored and her fever higher than it had been in weeks. The stress of the situation seemed to be affecting her physically, as if her small body was responding to the tension that filled the cabin like a living thing. Lark sat beside the child's bed, cooling her forehead with damp cloth and whispering words of comfort that seemed to calm them both. "She needs a doctor," Lark said quietly when Silas approached to check on his daughter. "Dr. Henley won't come out here now. Not with Roland's men in town making threats." Silas touched Emma's burning cheek with gentle fingers. "We'll have to manage with what we have." The rifle leaning against the wall near Emma's bed seemed to cast a shadow over the domestic scene, a reminder that their peaceful morning routine might be shattered at any moment. Silas had cleaned and loaded the weapon the night before, checking the action repeatedly until muscle memory took over conscious thought. As the morning progressed, signals began arriving from their scattered network of allies. Tom Bradley's mirror flashed twice from his distant farmhouse, the agreed-upon sign that riders had been seen on the main road heading toward the Brandt property. Mary Sullivan's younger brother appeared briefly on the ridge to the south, waving a red cloth that indicated movement from that direction as well. "They're coming from multiple directions," Silas observed, interpreting the signals with growing concern. "Roland's not taking any chances this time." "How many?" Lark asked, though she continued her gentle ministrations to Emma, as if maintaining normal routine could somehow protect them from what was approaching. "At least 6, possibly more. He's brought reinforcements from somewhere." Silas moved to the window that offered the best view of the main approach. Professional fighters, most likely. Men who make their living with violence. The implications were sobering. 3 against 6 or more represented odds that would challenge even experienced soldiers, let alone a farmer defending his home. But retreat was no longer an option. Emma was too sick to travel, and there was nowhere to run that Roland's resources couldn't eventually reach. As if summoned by their conversation, riders appeared on the horizon, moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew their quarry had nowhere to go. Roland led the group, easily recognizable even at a distance by his expensive clothing and the arrogant way he sat his horse. Behind him rode at least 8 men, all armed and moving, with the disciplined coordination of a military unit. "More than we expected," Silas said grimly. "He's not leaving anything to chance." Lark joined him at the window, her face pale but determined. "What's our best strategy? Make them pay for every foot of ground. Hope that the cost becomes higher than Roland is willing to accept." Silas checked his rifle one final time, the familiar weight of the weapon somehow comforting in his hands. "And pray that help arrives before we run out of ammunition." "What kind of help?" "Heinrich sent word to the territorial marshal yesterday. If we can hold out long enough, official authority might arrive to sort this out properly." It was a thin hope, but sometimes thin hope was all that stood between civilization and chaos. Outside, the riders had spread into a loose circle around the homestead, close enough to prevent escape, but far enough away to avoid immediate rifle fire. Roland's voice carried clearly across the distance when he finally spoke, amplified by the crisp morning air. and the expectant silence that had settled over the scene. "This is your final opportunity, Brant," he called out. "Send the woman out, and you can continue your pathetic existence. Refuse, and you'll discover how fragile life can be for those who oppose progress." "What progress?" Silas shouted back. "The progress of turning human beings into merchandise. The progress of profitable enterprise, conducted by men with vision and courage. You wouldn't understand such concepts. The exchange revealed the fundamental difference between them. Roland saw himself as a businessman operating in a competitive marketplace where human suffering was simply another factor to be calculated and managed. Silas saw him as a monster who had to be stopped regardless of the personal cost. From her bed, Emma stirred restlessly, her fever-bright eyes fixing on the rifle in her father's hands. "Papa, are the bad men coming?" "Yes, little bird, but Papa won't let them hurt you." The simple promise carried the weight of absolute commitment. Whatever happened in the next few hours, Silas would not allow Roland to take Lark or threaten Emma. Some lines could not be crossed, some evils could not be tolerated. Even if resistance meant certain death, the loaded rifle represented more than just a weapon. It was the physical manifestation of his determination to protect everything he had come to value in his hard-won life on the frontier. The attack began, not with dramatic charges or shouted threats, but with the methodical precision of professionals who understood that violence was simply another tool to achieve business objectives. Roland's men moved with coordinated efficiency, approaching the cabin from multiple angles while maintaining cover behind outbuildings and natural features of the landscape. Silas fired the first shot when one of the attackers broke cover near the barn, the rifle's sharp crack echoing across the homestead like thunder. The bullet found its mark, sending the man spinning to the ground, but before the echo faded, return fire began striking the cabin walls with deadly intent. "Stay down," Silas called to Lark as bullets splintered the logs around the windows. "Keep." Emma covered and watched the back door. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm of advance and retreat, with Roland's men probing for weaknesses in the cabin's defenses, while Silas tried to make each shot count. His ammunition was limited, and every missed shot brought him closer to the moment when the rifle would become useless weight in his hands. From her position near Emma's bed, Lark watched through a gap in the chinking between logs, tracking the movement of attackers who thought themselves hidden. When one of them crept close enough to the cabin's rear wall to pose a direct threat, she called out directions that allowed Silas to place a shot that sent the man scrambling back to safety. "Two more coming around the left side," she reported, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. The siege continued for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 30 minutes, each side testing the other's resolve and resources. Roland's voice could be heard occasionally, directing his men with the calm authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. Then the nature of the attack changed. Instead of continuing the careful probing assault, Roland's men began preparing for a coordinated rush that would overwhelm the cabin's defenses through sheer numbers. Silas recognized the shift in tactics and understood that the decisive moment had arrived. "They're going to charge," he told Lark, "all at once, from multiple directions. I can't stop them all. What do we do?" Before he could answer, a new sound reached them from the distance. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats that seemed to come from the direction of town. At first, Silas thought Roland had brought even more reinforcements, but then he recognized the distinctive sound of multiple riders moving at speed rather than the measured pace of tactical deployment. Through the window, he caught sight of riders cresting the ridge that overlooked the homestead. Leading them was a figure he recognized, Marshal James Crawford, the territorial lawman whose jurisdiction covered the vast expanse of central Montana. Behind him rode what appeared to be a hastily assembled posse of townspeople, including Heinrich, Kellerman, and several other men from Cedar Falls. The arrival of official authority changed everything about the tactical situation. Roland's men, who had been preparing for their final assault, suddenly found themselves caught between the cabin they were attacking and a force of legal representatives approaching from behind. Roland himself appeared from behind the barn where he had been directing the attack, his expensive coat now dirty and his composed demeanor cracking under the pressure of rapidly changing circumstances. The pocket watch he pulled from his vest, an ornate timepiece that spoke of wealth and status, seemed to mock him as he realized that time had run out for his carefully planned operation. "This is Marshal Crawford," came the authoritative voice from the approaching riders. "By order of the territorial government, you are commanded to lay down your weapons and submit to lawful authority." The response from Roland's men was immediate but fragmented. Some began to comply, understanding that resistance to federal marshals carried consequences far beyond their current contract. Others, perhaps too committed to the violent course they had chosen, continued to maintain their positions around the cabin. It was in this moment of confusion that the final confrontation between the principal players reached its climax. Roland, perhaps recognizing that his legal and financial leverage had been neutralized by the arrival of territorial authority, made a desperate decision to settle the matter through direct action. Drawing a silver-plated pistol from beneath his coat, he advanced toward the cabin with the reckless determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. "If I can't have her," he shouted, his voice carrying a note of hysteria that revealed how completely his careful plans had collapsed, "then no one will." The shot that ended Roland Keene's threat came not from Silas's rifle, but from Lark herself, using the small pistol Martha Kellerman had provided. The bullet struck Roland center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the muddy ground where he lay still, his ornate pocket watch spilling from nerveless fingers to land in the dirt beside him. The railroad watch, symbol of industrial progress and the power of concentrated wealth, lay broken and silent, its hands stopped forever at the moment when individual courage had triumphed over systemic corruption. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by Emma's labored breathing and the approaching voices of the marshal's posse, Silas and Lark looked at each other across the space that separated them. Both had been forever changed by the violence they had witnessed and participated in, but both had also proven themselves capable of defending what mattered most when the ultimate test came. The climax was over, but its consequences would echo through their lives for years to come. 3 months later, the Montana Territory had begun to show the first genuine signs of spring, and with them came a sense of renewal that seemed to touch everything on the Brant homestead. The snow had finally retreated to the highest peaks, revealing earth that was eager to accept the seeds of new beginning. Emma's recovery had been as gradual as the changing season, but just as certain. With Lark's careful nursing and the medicine that Marshal Crawford had brought from Helena, the child's cough had finally faded, replaced by the bright laughter that had been missing from the cabin for too long. She sat now in the afternoon sunshine, playing with the wooden horse her father had carved, while nearby Lark tended to the garden they had planted together. The investigation into Roland Keene's criminal enterprises had vindicated everything. Lark had told them and more. The documents she had hidden revealed a network of human trafficking that stretched from Chicago to San Francisco, involving dozens of accomplices and hundreds of victims. The territorial authorities had moved swiftly to shut down the operation and arrest those responsible, though Silas suspected that some of the worst offenders had simply disappeared into the vast anonymity of the American frontier. Lark herself had been cleared of any wrongdoing in Roland's death, the marshal ruling it a justified killing in defense of her own life and the lives of others. The attempted poisoning in Chicago had been more complicated to resolve, but with Roland dead and his crimes exposed, no one seemed particularly interested in pursuing charges against the woman who had tried to stop him. On Lark's finger now rested a simple band that Silas had carved from local cherry wood, its modest appearance belying the profound commitment it represented. They had married quietly in the Cedar Falls church, with Pastor Williamson performing a ceremony that acknowledged both the unconventional nature of their courtship and the genuine love that had grown from desperate circumstances. The new wedding. The ring represented everything that Roland's wealth and legal documents could not: a union based on choice rather than coercion, love rather than possession, hope rather than fear. It was rough-hewn and imperfect, but it was theirs, created by hands that knew the value of honest work and gentle care. "Emma's getting stronger every day," Lark observed, as she straightened from her work in the garden, brushing soil from her hands with the satisfied gesture of someone who had found peace in simple tasks. "So are we all," Silas replied, watching his daughter chase butterflies between the rows of vegetables that were already showing promising growth. The homestead that had once felt like a monument to loss and failure now hummed with the quiet activity of a family building something lasting together. The wounds left by violence and trauma were healing, though like all such injuries, they would leave scars that would serve as permanent reminders of how precious their peace truly was. As evening approached and they gathered around the table for their simple meal, Silas reflected on the strange paths that had brought them together. A mail-order bride arrangement born of desperation had somehow transformed into genuine partnership, and a homestead that had been dying of neglect now flourished under the care of three people who understood the true value of what they had found. Outside, the Montana wind still howled across the vast landscape, but inside their cabin, warmth and laughter had returned at last. The wooden wedding ring caught the lamplight as Lark reached across the table to help Emma with her food, and in that simple gesture Silas saw all the future he had ever wanted.